We have a special Big Ten matchup taking place this Saturday. It is a top four matchup between the fourth ranked 6-1, 3-1 in Big Ten play Ohio State Buckeyes, who are taking the road to play the third ranked, undefeated 7-0, 4-0 in Big Ten play Penn State Nittany Lions. And this matchup is taking place this Saturday at noon Eastern Time, streaming live on Fox. Big Noon Kickoff will be there. College Game Day will be at this location in Happy Valley, in College Park, and I am so excited for this game. Ohio State opened up as a 3.5-point favorite. The line has moved in their favor to now Ohio State minus 4.5. So laying 4.5 on the road in what I would say is the biggest game of James Franklin's career, or one of the biggest games of his career, and the same can be said about Ryan Day in Ohio State football right now. The Buckeyes are given a 61% chance to win this game per ESPN's FPI, and Ohio State and Penn State are both dealing with some pretty serious injuries that are definitely going to hamper their teams in this game, or at the minimum may hamper their teams in this game. For Ohio State, Josh Simmons is out for the year, and they have some other injuries along the offensive line, and Lathan Ransom was inactive against Nebraska, dealing with an injury. As for Penn State, well, Drew Aller didn't play in the second half against Wisconsin, and Franklin says he's a game-time decision. Deny Dennis Sutton and also Anthony Dunco, two players on the trenches for Penn State, were also injured in that matchup. So this is a fascinating game. Both teams have faced adversity. Ohio State, as we'll discuss in this preview and prediction video, is a bit more battle-tested, but Penn State's undefeated, and Penn State has something that they have not had in previous years under Franklin, at least since 2017. They have an offense that can create explosive plays. And as for Ohio State, they brought everyone back from a team last year that I thought was top 4 in America, and I thought for most of the year was certainly top 2, and I kind of still hold that opinion to this day about last year's Ohio State team, and they brought so much of those starters, so much of that team's production back. So this is just an incredible matchup, one that I am going to be glued to through all 4 quarters, all 60 minutes, even into overtime if it spills in there, and it very well could. So I'm looking forward to talking about this game with you. And before we do that, before I get into the statistics, the analytics, and give you my prediction as well, I ask that you subscribe to the channel, that you hit the notification bell, that you like the video, that you also share the video around to other college football fans so that they can experience this channel with you and with myself as well. College Football with Sam prides itself on being the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube, and with your help and only your help, we can become the best college football channel on YouTube, covering the sport from coast to coast and from the Mexican border to the Canadian border and any other distance you want to measure. And also comment your preview and prediction for this matchup down below. Even share a video from another channel who you thought did a good job of breaking down this game in the comment section so I can check that out and so that others can check it out. And also give a score prediction too. And also, last but not least, I'm saying a lot of alsos, but there's a lot that I want you to do because it helps you out and helps me out. Join our Discord server where we talk college football 24/7. Down in the comment section below or in the link at the top of the comment section, there's a link to that. And finally, if you want to support the channel monetarily, the Patreon page where you can sign up as a member, or the merchandise store you can purchase merchandise, a Penn State and Ohio State themed College Football with Sam t-shirt is available there. Same with all themes for all 18 Big Ten teams. Those links are also in the description at the top of the pinned comment. But subscribing, liking, hitting the bell, commenting, sharing the video around, joining the Discord server, all the things that can be done for free, that helps out the channel the most. So thank you very much. But let's dive in here because, man, I've been looking forward to this game all season long because from the beginning of the year, from really the beginning of the 2024 preseason, I thought to myself that this is really Penn State's only big game on the schedule. And every other game Penn State should win. And well, what do you know? They're 7-0. They're 4-0 in conference. This is the first time Penn State and Ohio State have played each other where Penn State's been undefeated since the 2018 season when they met up early in the season, not later in the season. And then you go back to 2017 where Penn State was also undefeated when these teams played. And yeah, I mean, this is just, It's such a critical matchup, and I think what is an underrated rivalry. Part of me was almost sad that this was not an annual protected rivalry by the new Big Ten scheduling arrangement. But anyway, is what it is, honestly. And I don't think Ohio State wanted more than one protected rival, as with the new college football playoff expansion. They shouldn't have, and they chose Michigan instead of Penn State. They could have done both, but I don't think that would have been wise with how the scheduling arrangements work. But anyway, enough of that. This is not conference realignment. We're talking about this game. And the reason why I brought up scheduling is because, well, Penn State has typically had two big games every year, Michigan and Ohio State. They get Ohio State at home. They don't play Michigan this year. In fact, their equivalent to the Michigan game was probably on the road at USC, where they nearly lost, but they came back winning 33-30 in overtime. As for Ohio State, from a preseason angle, I thought they had a much tougher schedule, but I also viewed them as a better team than Penn State in the preseason. I thought that they would enter this game undefeated. I thought Penn State would enter this game undefeated. Ohio State has one blemish in a loss to Oregon that in hindsight I should have seen coming, but I didn't. I thought Ohio State would win. They only lost by a point, though. 1 point, and Penn State hasn't played anyone close to the caliber of Oregon all season long. These two teams are so similar. You look at the power ratings here. Ohio State's viewed as 25.6 points better than the average college football team per FPI. Penn State's viewed as 19.6 points superior to the average college football team in FPI. S&P Plus from Bill Connolly thinks that the Buckeyes are 27.8 points better than the average college football team, and that Penn State's 23.8 points better than the average college football team. You add in home field advantage for Penn State, which I think could be as low as 3 points, just using that as the standard for all home field advantages in college football, unless you completely fail to fill up your stadium, like Rutgers and Indiana used to do. Now their stadiums are typically full, or at least have the capability of being full. But I also think that Penn State, you could give them as much as 6 or 7 points in home field advantage, because no, it's not the whiteout, but the student section and the fan base is going to bring energy, because Penn State's undefeated. They're top 5. This is the biggest game for James Franklin and Penn State as both a head coach and a program since probably 2017 or 2018 versus Ohio State. That's how big of a game this is. And it's going to be a rowdy, loud, intimidating home field environment. It will be. Ohio State's won in Happy Valley before. They have, but it could be a little bit different this time. We'll just have to see. But you add in the 3 or 7 points home field advantage for Penn State. According to FPI, Ohio State should win this game by anywhere from 3 points, or Penn State can win up to 1 point, in about that range if you take these power ratings as gospel and add in the home field advantage numbers that I just gave you. For S&P Plus, it's Ohio State winning anywhere from a point to Penn State winning by 3 points. So this is viewed as a very tight game by power ratings, I think rightfully so. You look at the points per play margin and the expected points added margins for these two teams. Ohio State is ahead of Penn State. They are by a significant margin. They have a 0.427 points per play margin. Penn State is a 0.27 points per play margin. And what this really says is that Ohio State scores 0.427 more points per one of their plays compared to one of their opponents' plays. So they're way more efficient with scoring points on a per play basis than their opponent is. As for Penn State, they score 0.27 more points per play than their opponent does. So they're much more efficient than their opponents are on a per play basis, but not to the same degree that Ohio State is. Not to the same degree one bit. And then you look at expected points added per margin, which factors in more things outside of just points and plays. It's a little bit more complex. Ohio State's still ahead of Penn State there. Expected points added is basically how much points are you expected to score on a given play, depending on like your field position or what type of play you're running. And Ohio State, well, they, on an average basis, they're expected to score a lot more points than their opponents are, and they do end up scoring a lot more points than their opponents do because they win the turnover battle, they have a lot of explosive plays, they're very efficient in the red zone. They have a 100% red zone efficiency on the season, and they're just, look, they're good. The offense has been for much of this season. Really, the Nebraska game was the only game where for a whole 60 minutes the offense looked less than desirable. Penn State, meanwhile, has had that type of performance against USC for a half, against Wisconsin for a half, against Illinois for, I'd say, probably a half or 3/4. Penn State, I don't think has had a game where the offense has looked horrific for the entire matchup, but they're certainly a second half team, and they're anything but a first quarter team where they're outside of the top 100 in time of possession share in the first quarter and also points scored in the first quarter. And I'll delve into some of these statistics more in this video, along with other videos that I release about this matchup. So please hit that notification bell because I'm going to be releasing more videos talking about this game in greater detail, some reasons why Penn State can win, why Ohio State can win, and also potentially more content as well. So thank you for hitting that notification bell. Finally, looking at these teams from a strength of schedule comparison and also factoring that into dominance, which is really what points per play and EPA margin is. Those margins show dominance, but they don't exactly address the strength of schedule component, at least not always. Ohio State has played the 39th toughest strength of schedule, and they're second in game control, which means only one team would be expected to perform higher than Ohio State, or at a higher level, is probably the better phrasing, than Ohio State, given their schedule. That team, when you look at it, is Ole Miss, which I think shows you how chaotic this season is. A 2-loss team is somehow first in game control. Why? I have absolutely no clue. I don't even think Ole Miss should be anywhere close to a top 5 in power ratings or in any type of rating system. Certainly not even in the top 10 in rankings. I understand they had close losses and some dominant wins, but their strength of schedule outside of that game against LSU, pretty weak, in my opinion. Penn State, they have played the 64th toughest strength of schedule. They're 19th in game control. That means 18 teams per ESPN's computer systems would perform better with Penn State's schedule than Penn State has. And I think a lot of that is due to the close games at halftime, the poor first half performances. They leap back in the second half, which is why they're top 25, top 20 in this metric, and they haven't really played anyone. They have not played a top 10 team all season long, so there is some uncertainty with how dominant, with how good Penn State really is. They could be a paper tiger. They also could be a sleeping tiger, a napping tiger. I think the critical matchup, or actually Lions probably the better example because Penn State is the Nittany Lions, but I just go to tiger instead of lion naturally in my head because I think the tiger is a cooler animal than the lion. But side note, anyway, the critical matchup here is an Ohio State rushing offense that leads the nation in multiple categories. And by leads the nation, I don't mean they're first in all the categories, but I mean they're a near elite to elite rushing offense by the numbers. And a part of that's their quarterback, their 2 running backs who make up the best running back duo in the country, or certainly one of the best, and an offensive line for much of the year has improved over last season's. Pitting that unit up against Penn State's defense, specifically their defensive front, but really the entire defense, D-line, linebacker, and DB. And these two groups are interesting because at the beginning of the year, earlier in the year, I would have told you that this may have been a huge concern for Penn State because earlier in the season, it looked like their defense would take a perhaps sizable step back from the defense that Manny Diaz manned last season. In fact, Penn State's defense right now is not even top 10 in defensive efficiency, whereas Manny Diaz's defenses were top 10 in both 2022 and last year in efficiency. But Penn State's defense is not top 10 this season in efficiency. Actually, no, they are, but they just joined after this week, and they're 10th, so barely top 10. The offense, though, is 12th. So Penn State as a team is changing a bit in how they play. They're more of an offensive team than in prior seasons, and they don't rely as much on their defense. But their defense is trending up. It was outside the top 10 for much of the year. It finally joined the top 10 after the Wisconsin game. It did a pretty good job against USC, who was high-flying on offense for the whole day they played. Did a very good job in that matchup after making second-half adjustments. And you compare that to Ohio State's rushing offense, they've gotten progressively worse, especially through the month of October. And a huge part of that is left tackle Josh Simmons, who is awesome in pass blocking, awesome in run blocking, a player who I didn't really recognize until shortly before his injury how good he was, and that's on me. He sadly got injured, and I think we should all be praying for him. It's the same with Aller. It's the same with Michalski. It's the same with Denai Dennis Sutton. Be praying for these injured players and just hope that they heal, that they get better, because injuries in this sport suck, and it's sad to see, well, these young men sometimes have their future earnings quickly decline because they get sidelined and injured while other players are able to showcase their talents. All that to say, he goes down and the entire offensive line collapses. You saw it slowly unfold against Oregon, where Michalski did an okay job in that game, but Oregon was also without Jordan Burch. And without Jordan Burch, Oregon does not have much of an outside pass rush. They don't have much depth there. They're better on the interior of their D-line than the exterior of their D-line. Nebraska, on the other hand, Nebraska is a similar caliber of D-line to Oregon. It's more inconsistent, yes, but they have Nash Hutmacher, Ty Robinson, Jamari Butler. They have some very good future NFL players on the D-line. They blew up Ohio State. They didn't even run for over 3 yards per carry, and that was sack adjusted. And outside of Travion Henderson's long runs against Oregon, Ohio State also didn't run for over 3 yards per carry, sack adjusted. So this rushing offense in the previous 2 games has mightily struggled. Penn State's defense, on the other hand, at times has struggled stopping the run, like against USC, for example. An athletic player in Woody Marks and another athlete in Quinton Joyner did very well on some explosive plays against Penn State. And you know, with Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson, they're explosive, they're athletic, they complement each other well, just like Woody Marks and Quinton Joyner. So there's just a lot with this matchup. How do Penn State's defensive tackles perform? Where against Wisconsin couldn't do a thing on the ground against them. And in the second half, Penn State was able to contain USC's rushing attack. But in the first half, Penn State was very vulnerable to some USC explosive runs, and especially runs that relied on athleticism and speed to stop, like on the outside, and some of those creative plays. What about Bowling Green? Bowling Green was able to run on Penn State's defense, and it's kind of a bend but don't break defense as well. It's not exactly a unit that is good at generating explosive or massive plays on the defensive side of the ball. They don't generate a ton of turnovers. They don't get a ton of sacks, but also they don't allow a whole lot of big plays either. Penn State, you look at their defense this season. They are top 10 in opponent points per game, opponent yards per point, opponent points per play. They are top 10 in opponent red zone score attempts per game, opponent red zone scores per game. They are top 10 in offensive touchdowns per game from their opponents and opponent offensive points per game. Ohio State, by the way, is top 5 in all of those categories. Top 5. So they lead Penn State in all the scoring defense categories, but Penn State's very close. And then you look at total defense. Penn State is top 5 in opponent yards per game. They're top 10 in opponent yards per play. They're top 5 in opponent first downs per play. They only allow 4.3 opponent yards per play. Ohio State allows 4.2. In terms of total defense, Ohio State allows 255.1 opponent yards per game. Penn State allows 267.7. And in terms of points, well, 14.3 allowed per game for Penn State, 11.9 allowed per game for Ohio State. And then, this is something I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but look at the third down conversion numbers for these defenses. Both are top 20. Penn State's 19th, Ohio State's 18th. Both of these defenses are very statistically impressive, and both have played bend but don't break for much of the season. Ohio State has gotten a little bit more aggressive, especially against Nebraska, in response to what happened against Oregon, where the defense didn't get any pressure. And they got some pressure against Nebraska, but it's Nebraska's offensive line. It's not Penn State's offensive line, which is much better. Penn State, on the other hand, has been pretty comfortable playing bend but don't break, and it's worked out for them well. But again, they haven't played an offense that is the caliber of Oregon's or even the caliber of Ohio State's. So that is fascinating. And then you look at Ohio State's ground attack here. And the Buckeyes, they are top 10. Or not top 10 anymore. They went outside of the top 10 after their game against Nebraska. But they're 15th in yards per carry, averaging 5.5. They have 188.1 rushing yards per game, 31st. When you factor in the amount of carries Ohio State has per game, only 34.4, which is 83rd in rush attempts per game, they're probably still a top 10 rushing offense when you factor in how many carries they get. When you're talking about the efficiency, how many rushing yards and how many yards per carry do you produce with the amount of attempts you have? They may still be a top 10 rushing offense in terms of efficiency there. However, they've been steadily declining there. In Penn State, they average 5.1 yards per carry, 23rd. They've had some issues running the ball against UCLA, for example. They struggled a bit against USC. Kind of got back more in rhythm using some trickery and putting in Bo Prabula, more mobile quarterback, in play and resting Aller against Wisconsin in the second half. They're averaging 197.1 rushing yards per game, which is 22nd. They do run for 4 more carries per game than Ohio State, 38.4, which is 29th. And they're top 30 in rushing play percentage, which means, well, they're one of the more run-heavy offenses in all of college football. 57.85% of their plays are rushing attempts. So, fascinating matchup here between these two rushing offenses and between these two defenses. I think Ohio State's rushing offense and Penn State's defense is really what we should be focusing on here. Let's dive deeper into these offenses, the defenses, and then we'll get to my prediction. That's what's really going to decide the game there, I think, is that matchup that I just discussed, and specifically these rushing offenses and then rushing defenses if you want to expand it out a little bit. But let's shift the magnifying glass to these offenses here. I'm going to give you some numbers, and you can let me know what you think in the comment section, or just out loud to yourself as if we're having a conversation. Ohio State scoring 40.3 points per game, that's 6th. Penn State scoring 33.3 points per game, 27th. You look at yards per point. Penn State, they take about 13.9 yards gained to score a point, that's 58th. Ohio State takes about 11.7 yards to gain a point, that's 16th. Penn State, they score 0.501 points per play, it's 21st. Ohio State scores 0.621 points per play, that's 3rd. You look at red zone scoring attempts per game, Ohio State's 43rd in that category, averaging 3.9, but they score 3.9 times in the red zone per game because their red zone scoring percentage is 100%. Penn State averages 4.3 red zone scoring attempts per game, it's 21st, and they average 4 red zone scores per game, which is 10th. They have a 93.33 red zone scoring percentage. Penn State scores 4.1 offensive touchdowns per game, it's 15th. Ohio State scores 5.3, that's 4th. And then you look at offensive points per game, which tries to factor out defensive scores. Ohio State scores 38.3. Penn State scores 32.4. You look here at time of possession. Ohio State leads Penn State in first quarter time of possession share. Ohio State only is top 50 out of all the first quarter possession share percentages. They're only top 50 in the fourth quarter, where they're 18th. Penn State is top 50 in the third quarter. They're 4th in the third quarter, which shows how dominant they are coming out of the half, and they're top 50 in the fourth quarter, but they're outside the top 100 in the first quarter. Ohio State's outside the top 100 in the second quarter. So both of these teams are closer to second half offenses, second half teams overall than first half teams. For example, Ohio State scores 19.4 second half points per game, which is 6th. Penn State scores 18.3, which is 8th. Ohio State scores 20.9 first half points per game, which is 12th, and Penn State scores 14.6, which is 53rd. Last thing I want to mention is Penn State averages 7 yards per play, which is 9th. Ohio State averages 7.3, which is 4th. You look at punts per play and punts per offensive score. Penn State averages, well, they're top 20 in both of those. Ohio State's outside the top 30 in punts per play, but 32nd, so pretty close there. Penn State takes more seconds per play slightly than Ohio State does. Penn State's 5th in third down conversion percentage, converting half of their third downs. Ohio State's still good in that category, just not as good. They convert 43.9% of their third downs. So take from that what you will. I just very briefly want to talk about some of these players here. I think Ohio State is better at wide receiver, and I think that Seth McLaughlin is a better center as of right now than Nick Dawkins, but it's very close. You look at the rest of the offensive line for Ohio State, I do think that Penn State's guards, Olivega Ione, Sal Wormley, and then he also got J.B. Nelson in at depth and Cooper Cousins there. I think that room is better than Ohio State's Tegra Shabola, Luke Montgomery, Austin Sierveld, and Donovan Jackson. And I expect, by the way, Donovan Jackson to start at left tackle. I mean, the fact that Michalski couldn't put weight on that leg again, be praying for him. That looked bad. The fact that he couldn't put a weight on it. Like, maybe not bad as in season ending. I don't know if it's season ending, but he may be out for a few weeks at minimum. I don't know about this stuff because I'm not an insider and coaches often don't share it to even the insiders, but I would expect Donovan Jackson to start at left tackle. I would. And I think that Penn State's better. They're better depth-wise at every position compared to Ohio State. They've recruited better on the O-line. They've developed better on the offensive line, which is a real darn shame because Ohio State is better, believe me, at the skill positions or similar outside of tight end, where I think Penn State clearly rules there. But tackle is also an advantage point for the Nittany Lions. I think that Drew Shelton, Anthony Dunco, if healthy, Jiven Williams, and Nolan Rucci are better than what Ohio State currently has there in Josh Fryer, George Fitzpatrick, whether it's Zen Mahalski or Donovan Jackson. It's just Ohio State's offensive line due to injury, but also you got to look at Justin Fry and the poor recruiting and development. It's a mess right now, the offensive line is. But wide receiver, that goes to the Buckeyes. I think that quarterback, and I'm even going to say running back, I think those areas are contested. Aller this season is top 10 in QBR. Same with Will Howard. Howard has 1,795 passing yards. He completes 74% of his passes. He's averaging 9.9 yards per attempt, 17 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 183.9 passer rating. Aller is a 174.6 passer rating, 12 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. He's averaging 10 yards per pass attempt. He's completing 71.3% of his passes, and he has 1,640 passing yards. They're very similar overall. And Aller has an 83.6 QBR. Will Howard is a little bit higher, just a little bit higher with an 86.6 QBR. I'm fascinated to see both of these quarterbacks as I think they're top 10. And it's also interesting that Will Howard's from Pennsylvania, Drew Aller's from Ohio State. So there's easily a world in like an alternate universe where Will Howard's the starting quarterback for Penn State because they offered him maybe out of high school instead of not because they didn't in real life. And Will Howard, therefore, is going to have a chip on his shoulder in that regard. And Ohio State recruits Aller early, offers him, and he's Ryan Day's starting quarterback. It's interesting to think about that. But I think there is a lot of competitiveness there. If you put a gun to my head, I would say Penn State has better depth at quarterback than Ohio State does. I'm very impressed with Pribula. I think that Penn State could actually win big games with Pribula. It'd be harder than with Aller, but it's doable because of how he fits the offensive system. And I would lean toward Aller being slightly better than Will Howard, but that's gun to my head type stuff. For now, I'm going to say push. As for the running backs, I would lean toward Henderson and Judkins still over Singleton and Katron Allen. And I think a big part of the struggles in the run game have to do with the offensive line. But Ohio State's offensive line was not good last year, and Henderson found ways to make it work. Judkins is looking like he's fitting this offensive line and rushing attack about as well as Mayan Williams or Chip Trainum or some of the other running backs who've kind of been worn out by Ohio State over the previous few seasons. Like, he has not had good games against Oregon and Nebraska, where he was held to under 2 yards per carry. And I get that those were awesome run defenses. They are. But you expect to do better than that from a running back who was as productive as he was in the SEC, and also him being paired with Henderson and the passing attack that Ohio State has. Speaking of passing offense, Ohio State this year, they are averaging through the air 9.6 yards per pass attempt, which is 6th, and 13.3 yards per completion, which is 22nd. I did not expect this, but Penn State actually leads them in both of those categories. They average 9.9 yards per pass attempt, which is 4th, and 13.6 yards per completion, which is 17th on the season. So something to keep in mind. I think Ohio State is the much more talented passing offense. I do think they have the better passing offense too, but Ohio State has Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, Emeka Egbuka, and then G. Scott Jr. at tight end. Tyler Warren's much better at tight end with 559 receiving yards on the year, but Penn State just has Julian Fleming, Liam Clifford, and Harrison Wallace III at wide receiver, and they're having themselves a pretty productive season. So pay attention to that receiver core for Penn State. Again, wide receiver and center, I think, go to the Buckeyes. Quarterback, running back's a bit of a push. Tight end, tackle, and guard, I think, lean Penn State here. Defensively, These two teams have some of the most talented NFL ready in terms of the amount of NFL players, defenses in all of college football. I love Ohio State at safety, especially if Lathan Ransom is healthy. But if he isn't, I think that Malik Hartford, Keenan Nelson Jr., Jalen McClain, and especially Caleb Downs are going to do a good job. And Penn State's dinged up at safety. Remember that. Like, they don't have Kevin Winston Jr. He's injured, and I don't think he'll play in this game. I wouldn't expect him to play in this game. It was stated a long time ago, back in September, that his season would keep him out for the long term. I still like Jalen Reed and Zakee Wheatley, by the way. I think that's a very good safety duo, but I do like Ohio State a little bit more there. Jalen Kimber's done well at corner. A.J. Harris has been phenomenal at corner. Elliott Washington II, Cam Miller, and some other players in that DB room have done well. And Ohio State's been very disappointing at corner. Yes, Jordan Hancock has played well, but Denzel Burke, against Nebraska, I was watching him get a little bit burned too. I think there's something up with him. And Davison Igbinosun has been a little bit too aggressive for what you want in a cornerback. He's been caught, I think, a lot of times interfering with opposing wide receivers. So there are some questions at corner, and that's why I have that being a push. I think Ohio State has more talent and more depth at corner, so I would side with them if you put a gun to my head. But Penn State's been overperforming expectations at corner. Ohio State's been drastically underperforming there. And I think at linebacker and defensive line, I would take Penn State's Donnie Dennis-Sutton or Smith Vilbert, whoever starts there, Zane Durant, Keziah Izzard, Devon J. Thomas, Alonzo Ford Jr., Amin Vanover, Abdul Carter, Tony Roas, Kobe King, Dominic DeLuca, Tyler Elsdon. I would take them over Ohio State's Jack Sawyer, Caden Curry, Caden McDonald, Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams, JT Tuimoloau, Kenyatta Jackson Jr., Sonny Styles, CJ Hicks, Cody Simon, and Arvell Reese. I would, because at this point, they have performed at a slightly higher level. And Ohio State, I think, they lead Penn State in terms of sacks. They have 20 sacks on the year. Penn State only has 14. Penn State has 27 passes defended, 6 picks, 5 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries. Ohio State has 20 passes defended, 5 interceptions, 7 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries. However, Ohio State got 3 sacks against Nebraska. May I mind you, blitzing on a lot more of their plays than I've seen from Jim Knowles, and it cost them because Nebraska was able to run the football and pick up some chunk plays as a consequence. What happens when you blitz, when your secondary is not as secure as, let's say, Ohio State's secondary was last year. Last year, their secondary, I remember seeing a 0 blitz one time, and the DBs were covering everyone. That's insane. That's how good Ohio State's silver bullet secondary was last year. When you don't have a elite secondary, an ultra secure secondary, and you blitz, you are risking giving up a big play, because if one DB takes a bad angle or trips, it's over. You've allowed a big play, or maybe you've even allowed, dare I say it, a touchdown, the worst type of play that you can allow on defense. I think that if you take the players for who they are and adjust for scheme, which is what it is at this point, both teams don't obviously run the same scheme, I do think Penn State's front 7 players are better. I just don't think they've played as aggressive football as Ohio State has. I don't think so. They play a very bend but don't break defense. They're very comfortable giving up some points and yards in the first half and letting you reveal yourself a bit. And then they take notes, they adjust in the second half, and there you go. Let's review some of these defensive statistics again. Penn State on defense. They're top 15 in opponent rushing yards per game, opponent rushing first downs per game, and opponent yards per carry. Ohio State's top 10 in all of those. So slightly better again, and teams run on Ohio State more than they do on Penn State, because I think Ohio State's expected to be more vulnerable in stopping the run than most schools in the country, whether it's due to narrative or there's an actual exploit there. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. Both of these teams are top 10 in opponent yards per game, opponent yards per play, and also opponent first downs per game. They're some of the best in the country. Interestingly enough, you look at pass defense here. Ohio State, they have a 9.76 sack percentage, which is 11th. Penn State only has a 6.17 sack percentage, which is 61st. You look at opponent yards per pass attempt. Ohio State allows 6.2, which is 23rd. Penn State only allows 5.7 at 7th. But then when you look at opponent yards per completion, Penn State allows 10, it's 11th. Ohio State allows 9.6, which is 5th. I think the tell there is that Ohio State, for most of the year, has played a bend but don't break defense, and they've played very off of the wide receivers. Very, and I mean very, off of the wide receivers. The Iowa game is a prime example of this. Nebraska was an example of this for parts of the game, where you would have open guys and they would give up yards. As for Penn State, I don't think I know exactly enough about schematics. Typically, I don't say this on the channel. I don't know if I know enough about schematics to dive deep into why there's such a big difference there in opponent yards per pass attempt, but it's something to pay attention to. It has to do with the fact that Ohio State allows opponents to complete 64.32% of their throws. Meanwhile, Penn State only allows opponents to complete 57.28% of their throws. As I've said before, I do think that Penn State's secondary is overachieving everyone's expectations. Ohio State's dramatically, and I mean dramatically, underachieving at that position. So those are the defenses. I'd take Ohio State at safety. I'd take Penn State's D-line and linebacker core. Cornerback's a little bit of a push. You look in the trenches, I would take Penn State in the trenches. I think they have a better offensive line and a better D-line. It's not dramatically better at both positions, though with injuries they may have the dramatically better O-line. But I think they have the slightly better D-line as well. So if you're better on both sides of the trenches, you have the better trench play. It's just that simple. As for special teams, Penn State and Ohio State are both toward the bottom of the Big Ten in terms of net yards per punt and also just straight up yards per punt. Penn State has recently found a kicker in Ryan Barker who's been pretty accurate, and Jaden Fielding for Ohio State's only had 4 field goal attempts. Both of these special teams units are just kind of what they are. Average, below average, some would maybe say bad. I think special teams could be a factor in this game, especially in a game that's projected to be as close as this one is. It could also kind of be null and void in a matchup like this, though, because both special teams units are not special. Looking at the coaching edge, I think everyone would agree that Day is a better head coach than James Franklin. I certainly think so. I think he's a significantly better coach than Franklin. But I think, to James Franklin's credit, that he has a better coaching staff right now. He has a better support staff than Day does. I think that Andy Kotelnicki is a much better offensive coordinator than Chip Kelly. I think what Tom Allen has done with his defense is more secure, it's more stout, and I think it makes more sense than what Jim Knowles is doing with his defense. And I think that the offensive and defensive assistant coaches, on an average basis, are slightly better for Penn State than Ohio State. Look at the offensive line, for example. Phil Trautwein inherited a pretty mediocre program in terms of producing offensive linemen, and they're producing at a high level there. Justin Fry inherited a program that's been very proud on the offensive line for Ohio State, and they've looked mediocre and a little bit damaged in 2 out of his 3 seasons there. Maybe they'll redeem themselves this year, but that's a big if. And then you look on the D-line. For Larry Johnson, they always recruit well there. Always. They always recruit well, Ohio State does. And they're still not producing to the level that they need to, particularly in big games. Against Oregon, they didn't get all that much pressure. For Penn State, the biggest game they've had this season was against USC, where they didn't get a ton of pressure, but they got some. The next biggest was against Illinois. And they had like 7 sacks and 13 TFLs there. And I think that Deion Barnes has done a very good job with the talent he has on the D-line. And that's just the trenches. Look at other places. Look at like the secondary, for example, this year. Penn State, Franklin's very coordinator dependent. And I have a feeling that he knows that because the coaching staff that he has in terms of assistants and coordinators is among the best in the country. And Penn State's getting more physical. They're better conditioned. And Ohio State has some questions with physicality and conditioning. They do. It's a reality. And that leads me to pick, and I've already explained this, I think, throughout the video and the information that I've given you. I'm thinking Penn State's going to win here. And I think they're not going to win big, but you're going to see, I think, that they're the better team in 4 quarters. They are the team that's better built to win the Big Ten. In fact, with the injuries that Ohio State's incurred, I think they're the team that's better built to win the title at this point. Better assistant coaches. They're deeper than Ohio State at a variety of positions, especially in the trenches. They could go 3 deep in their defensive tackle room. Ohio State can't do that. They could go 2 deep on their offensive line. Ohio State can't do that. they can go too deep at quarterback and still have some dynamic playmaking capability, or dynamism, if that's a word. Ohio State can't do that with Devin Brown or Julian Sayin. They just can't. And Penn State is like 3 or even 4 really good tight ends. Ohio State has maybe 1 okay tight end. Really what the scheme comes down to is if James Franklin's going to wet the bed for the nth time in a row, that's what favors Ohio State here, straight up. Not much else favors them in this matchup. The laws of the Big Ten, as I said on Twitter, the law of trench play matters, and interior trench play is kind of a 1A to that rule, matters even more. The law of game control, of run the ball, as Brent Key said at Georgia Tech, which applies to any team that wants to win a title, that favors Penn State here. That screams Penn State, especially based off of the last 2 games that these 2 programs have played. So I'm taking them to cover the 4.5-point spread. I'm taking them to win 34-20. Can I be wrong? Of course I can be wrong. I've had this opinion, though, since the preseason. In the preseason, I thought that Penn State would win this game in a closer fashion than now. But with the injuries that Ohio State's incurred, they're going on the road. I think Penn State was resting some guys that they could have played against Wisconsin, but they didn't because they want them healthy for Ohio State, and I think they will be. Penn State's going to be stronger. They're going to be deeper. And while Ohio State's more battle-tested, the battle testing has only resulted in injuries, not necessarily a proud banner for them to hold. So I'm taking Penn State here to win 34-20. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Connor OH for being Heisman members and sponsoring this video and channel. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, Tyler Nye for being All-American members, and thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being all conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Please check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. I will see you all guys very soon. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. And go Nittany Lions and go Buckeyes.